A grieving veteran walked into the Wind River Mountains with nothing but silence in his chest and a loyal German shepherd at his side. He wasn't searching for adventure, only distance from memories that refused to fade. But when a sudden snowstorm erased the trail and night closed in fast, the wilderness became something far more dangerous than he expected. Just as hope began to thin, his dog caught a scent and led him to a strange, century-old sled cabin buried beneath the drifts, a shelter built by hands long gone, yet still standing against the storm. What he found inside had been waiting through generations of winter, and by morning he would understand that he had not walked into the mountains to escape his past, but to carry someone else's unfinished story into the light. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and share where you're watching from in the comments. Your support means more than you know. Snow moved sideways across the Wind River ridges, fine as ground glass, blurring sky and earth into one endless pale breath of winter. Ulrich Boone walked into that breath with the steady, deliberate stride of a man who had learned long ago that panic wastes heat. At 55, he carried the broad, weight-set frame of someone who had lifted stretchers, ropes, and other people's broken futures for most of his adult life. His shoulders were still powerful, but they sloped slightly now, as if grief had weight that muscle could not train against. His hair, once dark, had faded into iron gray, clipped short out of habit, revealing a weathered scalp lined by old scars. A trimmed beard, more silver than brown, sharpened the angles of his jaw, giving him a stern, carved look that strangers often mistook for hardness. In truth, Ulrich spoke gently, moved carefully around others, and apologized too often, a trait that had deepened after the winter he lost his wife Mara to a long illness that thinned her voice but never her patience, and months later lost his grown daughter Linnea in a highway ice crash he still replayed at night in merciless detail. Since then, silence had followed him like a second shadow, filling rooms, stretching across mornings, sitting at the edge of his bed before dawn. The mountains did not cure that silence, but they gave it space wide enough that he could breathe beside it without feeling crushed. Moving just ahead of his left knee trotted Coda, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a thick black saddle of fur along his back, fading into warm tan legs and chest, built lean and athletic rather than bulky, his movements precise, economical, almost thoughtful. His amber eyes missed little. They tracked wind direction, distant sounds, and the small changes in Ulrich's breathing that signaled fatigue or rising memory. Coda had once worked beside Ulrich during military search and rescue deployments, trained in tracking and alert work. But what defined him most now was steadiness, the quiet choice to stay close without crowding, to lean his weight lightly against Ulrich's calf when nightmares jerked him awake, to wait out long pauses without impatience. They had set out that morning under a high, pale sky, the trail firm, the air crisp, the kind of winter day that feels honest. But by mid-afternoon, the weather shifted with mountain indifference. Wind slid down the slopes in colder layers, carrying new snow that erased old prints. The familiar trail markers, a bent pine, a split boulder, softened, then disappeared under drifting white. Ulrich noticed the change with the trained awareness that had once kept people alive. He checked his compass, adjusted his line, lengthened his stride to reach lower ground before dusk. Still, the land rearranged itself faster than he expected. Ridges blurred into each other. The shallow gully he meant to follow filled with wind-packed snow, its edges indistinguishable from the slope. He stopped once, slow exhale fogging his beard, listening. No birds, no distant creak of branches, only the constant whisper of falling ice. Inside his chest, an older storm stirred. Not fear of dying, but the heavier dread of being lost again, of failing to bring someone home, of watching a situation tilt beyond reach. His mind tried to pull him backward, to the hospital room where machines hummed around Mara, to the flashing lights on frozen asphalt the night Linnea did not answer his call. He pressed those images down, the way he had been taught. Name the present, control what you can. "We're fine," he murmured, voice low, more for himself than for the dog. Coda glanced back, ears pricked, reading tone rather than words. The dog's tail hung neutral, not tucked, not high, alert but calm. That steadiness anchored Alric more than any map. He adjusted the straps of his worn pack, the canvas darkened by years of weather, and angled toward a line of denser spruce that might break the wind. Snow thickened, flakes growing larger, heavier, clinging to his lashes. Light drained from the sky faster than it should have, the flat gray of late afternoon sliding toward the deeper blue of early night. His thighs burned from pushing through drifts that reached mid-calf. Each step made a soft, swallowing sound. He checked his watch. Still time, but less than comfort allowed. He considered turning back, then knew with a tightening in his gut that back no longer meant anything clear. The slope behind looked like the slope ahead. Landmarks had been rewritten. A quiet, unwelcome understanding settled over him. He had walked beyond the point where memory could guide him. Not panic, he told himself again, but his pulse thudded harder, echoing in his ears. Coda slowed, then stopped outright, head high, nostrils working. The dog turned in a small circle, sampling air, then chose a direction with sudden certainty and gave a short, sharp bark. Not alarm, but insistence. Alric hesitated only a second before trusting him. That trust had been forged in places louder and darker than this. He followed as Coda angled off what had been the trail, weaving between trees whose lower branches wore thick white sleeves. Wind gusted, driving snow sideways, stinging exposed skin along Alric's cheeks. He bent into it, one gloved hand on the strap across his chest, the other free for balance. Inside, thoughts thinned to essentials. Foot placement, breath rhythm, keep moving. Yet beneath those practical layers, something else moved. A weary admission he rarely voiced. He had come out here not just to walk, but to see if distance could dull the sharp edges of memory, to test whether grief lost its teeth in the open cold. Instead, the mountain had stripped away even the illusion of control. He was small again, a single figure in an immense white field, responsible for one life at his side and unsure of the path forward. Coda surged ahead through a low drift, then vanished briefly behind a stand of young firs. A spike of alarm pierced Alric. He called the dog's name, voice rough in the muffled air. A heartbeat later, Coda reappeared, bounding back, snow crusted along his muzzle, eyes bright with urgency. He seized the cuff of Alric's sleeve gently but firmly, tugging once, then turning, pulling. "All right," Alric said, breath clouding between them, surrendering to that lead. They pushed on as daylight thinned to the dim silver of approaching dusk, the world reduced to the circle of space they could see, and the steady pull of a dog who seemed certain something lay ahead worth reaching. Behind them, the wind closed their tracks without hesitation, smoothing over the proof they had ever passed that way. and Ulrich felt the full truth settle, heavy and cold as the snow on his shoulders. He was lost in the Wind River winter, and for now, the only direction that existed was the one Coda chose. Coda did not bark often without reason, so when the sharp sound split the muffled storm and he lunged forward, teeth catching the cuff of Ulrich Boone's sleeve, the 55-year-old followed without argument, boots plunging through drifts that reached nearly to his knees as twilight dissolved into a blue-gray haze. His tall, broad frame leaned against the wind, gray hair crusted with snow, silver-threaded beard rimed with ice, the stern angles of his weathered face set in concentration rather than fear, because discipline had long ago replaced panic in him. Yet beneath that trained calm, his chest carried the hollow ache that had never left after Mara's hospital room fell silent, and his daughter Linnea's laughter was replaced by the memory of flashing emergency lights on frozen asphalt. And that ache pressed now as heavily as the snow on his shoulders. Ahead, through curtains of white, a darker mass began to take shape, not the loose geometry of fallen timber, but straight edges and deliberate lines. And as they drew closer, the outline clarified into something that did not belong to this century. A long, low wooden structure, half buried in wind-sculpted drifts. Its sides curved subtly, as if shaped to move, its runners still visible beneath packed ice. Iron bands, dull with age, yet intact. The whole thing resembling a freight sled cabin once hauled by horse teams across frontier winter routes. Coda's amber eyes shone with urgency as he circled the structure, tail low but wagging once, twice, reading safety where Ulrich felt only wary disbelief. The wood was thick-hewn pine, grayed by decades but unrotted, the roof pitched steep enough to shed weight, its eaves carved with simple geometric notches meant to break wind. Whoever built it had understood winter as an enemy to be engineered against, not merely endured. Ulrich ran a gloved hand over the door plank, feeling the solid resistance beneath frost. And a strange sense stirred. This place had waited, not abandoned, but paused, like breath held too long. The latch was iron, heavy, but when he lifted it, the door gave with a slow inward groan, releasing a draught of air that was cold but dry, untouched by the storm's wet violence. He ushered Coda inside and shut the door firmly behind them, sealing out the hiss of driven snow. Darkness filled the interior at first, thick and close, but his headlamp beam revealed a narrow, purposeful space. Plank walls, a compact iron stove bolted near center, shelves built into the curved sides, a bench, and a low ceiling braced by crossbeams shaped by adze rather than machine. No modern clutter, only tools hung in careful order. A poker, a small shovel, a soot brush, all aged but serviceable. The floorboards were tight-fitted, free of rot, dust lying undisturbed like a thin veil of years. Ulrich moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had lit fires in worse places, kneeling stiffly, shoulders broad beneath his snow-darkened jacket, his breath still uneven from the climb. Coda shook himself once, spraying frost, then stood alert, scanning corners with the disciplined stillness of a trained working dog, ears pricked at the smallest creak. Above the stovepipe, Ulrich's light caught shallow carvings in the wood, arrows, half-circles, and narrow lines etched with deliberate spacing, too precise to be decoration. He traced them with a gloved finger, memory stirring from old field manuals about improvised shelters and ventilation. Below the symbols, nearly hidden by soot shadow, were faint words cut by hand. Open low vent against east wind. Close upper half when gusts rise. The message, carved by someone long gone, carried the calm authority of experience, handed forward. Alric's throat tightened unexpectedly, not from smoke, but from recognition. Another survivor, another mind that had faced a storm and chosen to leave instructions for the next unknown soul. He stacked a few pieces of the dry, split kindling resting beneath the bench, marveling at how well they had kept, struck his lighter, and coaxed flame into the stove. At first the fire faltered, smoke curling back, stinging his eyes. But he remembered the carvings, adjusted the small iron vents accordingly, and tried again. This time the draft caught with a low, eager hum, and orange light bloomed, pushing warmth outward in slow, steady waves. Shadows retreated along the curved walls, revealing more details. A tin cup hooked neatly by the shelf, a folded wool blanket, gray with age but intact, and beside it a small leather pouch, stiff and darkened, resting alone. Alric did not open it, sensing instinctively that this place held stories that required patience. Instead, he sat heavily on the bench, elbows on his knees, palms extended toward the growing heat, feeling sensation return to fingers numbed by wind. Coda settled close, flank touching Alric's boot, amber eyes reflecting firelight, watchful but no longer tense. Outside, the storm thudded against the cabin in blunt waves, yet inside the air felt held, as though the structure itself understood how to stand between chaos and breath. Alric's gaze drifted to the carved symbols again, and something shifted inside him, not a miracle, not relief from grief, but the faint easing that comes when a stranger's foresight reaches across time to steady you. He had spent months feeling as if the world had closed its doors one by one, yet here, a door built by unknown hands had opened without question. The hidden message was simple, practical, but beneath it lay another truth he could almost name. Someone had once believed the future still mattered enough to prepare for. His mind, so used to circling loss, paused there. He imagined a man shaping these boards by lamplight, hands raw from cold, carving directions not for himself, but for whoever might come after. The idea pressed gently against Ulrich's own numb interior, like warmth seeping into frozen ground. Coda lifted his head suddenly, not alarmed but attentive, nose twitching toward the leather pouch, then toward the door, then back, as if sensing layers of scent older than memory. Ulrich watched him, recognizing that same canine curiosity that once led them to trapped hikers or buried avalanche gear. "Easy," he murmured, voice softer than it had been in months, and the word surprised him with how natural it sounded. The fire steadied, the iron stove ticking as it warmed, and the cabin filled with a low, living hush. Outside might be a world erased by snow, but here, within thick boards and careful engineering, there existed proof that endurance could be designed, that survival was sometimes an inheritance. Ulrich did not yet know whose shelter this had been, or why it still stood when so much else fell. But as the storm raged unseen beyond the door, he felt something unfamiliar. His grief, though still vast, no longer seemed like the only thing occupying the room. The fire in the iron stove had settled into a steady, low glow when Ulrich Boone finally noticed the bundle high on the curved shelf, half hidden in shadow, where the lantern light did not naturally reach. And it was not curiosity alone that drew his eyes upward, but the quiet persistence of Coda, who had risen from his place by Ulrich's boots, and now stood beneath the shelf, head tilted, nose lifted, inhaling with slow, deliberate pulls, as if a scent older than dust had stirred his trained instincts. Ulrich pushed himself to his feet, joints stiff, broad shoulders brushing the cabin wall, and reached up, gloved fingers closing around a roll of papers bound with a narrow leather thong, gone dry and brittle with age. He brought it down carefully and sat again on the bench, the firelight shaping deep lines along his weathered face, silver in his beard catching orange flickers, his expression not eager but solemn, the way he had once looked when unwrapping a casualty's personal effects to find a name. Coda settled close, but did not lie down, amber eyes tracking Ulrich's hands, ears forward, sensing significance without understanding it. The leather tie gave with a soft crackle, and the papers loosened into a small stack of folded sheets, edges yellowed, fibers delicate but intact in the cabin's preserved dryness. The handwriting that filled them was steady, yet pressed hard into the page, the strokes of someone accustomed to shaping tools or reins rather than letters. And at the top of the first page was a name written with deliberate care. Thane Alder. Ulrich read in silence, the only sound the low murmur of the stove and the wind's distant push against the cabin's outer walls. And as the words unfolded, a life emerged across the gulf of more than 100 winters. Thane had been a freight hauler and trapper by trade, broad-backed, weather-browned, his hands described in one line almost with humor as too large for careful work, yet forced into it. A man who spoke little, according to his own writing, not from coldness, but from the belief that words cost warmth better spent on action. A belief shaped, he noted once, after losing an older brother to fever during a blizzard when they were boys, a loss that carved in him a quiet vow to always build something between those he loved and the worst of the weather. His wife, Lillian, appeared next in the journal's narrow margins, described not as fragile, but as fine-boned and stubborn as spring willow, with pale, freckled skin that burned easily under high sun, chestnut hair he braided for her when her cough worsened, and gray-blue eyes that, Thane wrote, held light even when mine failed. The cough was the thread that ran through many entries, growing heavier as early snows came, until one page, ink smudged where the pen must have paused too long, admitted they had halted their westward route because Lillian could no longer endure the jolting travel. With them was their son, Caleb, 8 years old, narrow-faced, quick with questions, hair the same brown as his mother's, forever carving shapes into spare wood with a knife. Thane both worried over and secretly admired him for handling with care. Ulrich felt his throat tighten as he read of evenings inside the sled cabin when Thane read aloud by lamplight, while Lillian stitched, Caleb asleep with one hand still curled around a scrap of carved pine. Outside, winter gathered. Inside, a small circle of warmth held. The entries grew shorter as the season deepened, each line more deliberate, less room for complaint, more for record. Wood stores counted, vent positions tested, snow walls reinforced along the windward side. Thane wrote as a man measuring time by endurance rather than days. Coda shifted suddenly, nails clicking against the boards, and moved to the far corner near the bench, where the firelight did not fully reach. Nose pressed low, tail held level in focused alertness. He pawed once, then again, not frantic but precise, and let out a soft, insistent whine that Ulrich recognized from years of search work. Indication, not distress. Ulrich set the journal carefully beside him and knelt, his tall frame folding with the practiced care of someone used to working in tight spaces. Gloved fingers running along the floor seam where Coda's nose had traced. One plank gave a faint, different sound when tapped, and with slow pressure he pried it up, revealing a narrow cavity beneath, dry as the air above, hidden with intention. Inside lay a cloth bundle so fragile it seemed made of dust, and he lifted it with both hands, bringing it into the lantern glow. The fabric parted in his grip, and the contents emerged, not with the glitter of wealth, but the quiet gravity of meaning. 2 silver rings, dulled by time, yet unmistakably cared for. A small child's necklace of simple carved bone beads, threaded on leather. And a folded scrap of parchment, thicker than the journal pages. Ulrich's chest tightened, not with greed, but with the sudden sense of trespass into someone's final safeguard. He unfolded the parchment and found a map, hand-drawn, lines marking a valley, a river bend, a stand of spruce, notations for land they had intended to claim when Lillian recovered, when winter passed, when the road opened again, as Thane had written with a confidence that now felt like a fragile relic itself. Ulrich understood with the clarity of shared grief that this map was not a plan fulfilled, but a promise interrupted. He picked up the rings next, their weight slight in his palm, and imagined Thane slipping them off, only to hide them from theft or loss, telling himself he would retrieve them in spring. The thought pressed against Ulrich's own memories of removing Mara's ring at the hospital, only because nurses had asked him to keep it safe. The parallel struck deep and sudden, and for a moment he had to steady his breath, the old ache rising like cold water in his lungs. Coda leaned in, muzzle brushing Ulrich's forearm, offering simple contact without demand, and Ulrich rested his other hand briefly on the dog's thick black and tan ruff, grounding himself in present warmth. He returned his attention to the journal, turning to the final page where the ink had faded, but not vanished. Thane's script there was slower, the pressure uneven, yet still firm enough to endure, and the words cut through time with startling immediacy. If any soul finds this place, do not let us be lost as snow beneath sun. Carry our names where wind cannot erase them.
Ulrich lowered the page, the cabin suddenly feeling both small and vast, containing not only himself and Coda, but the weight of a family's unfinished hope. The hidden message was not a plea for rescue, they were long beyond that, but a request for remembrance, for continuation, for someone else to bridge the gap between what had been tried and what had survived. Ulrich looked at the rings, the child's necklace, the map, and understood that these were not treasures to keep, but a trust to carry. And the realization settled with the gravity of duty he had not felt since the last time he had worn a uniform. The storm outside seemed to recede to a distant murmur, as if the cabin itself held its breath. And in that stillness, Ulrich felt the faintest shift inside him. Not relief, not healing complete,
but the first sense that his survival might be tied to more than endurance.
That his steps from this night forward might carry not only his own losses, but the memory of those who had built this shelter against a winter just as fierce. Coda, sensing the change in his breathing, finally lay down, chin on paws, amber eyes half-lidded yet watchful, as if standing guard over both past and present. Alric replaced the items gently in the cavity, not sealing them away forever, but keeping them safe until he could decide how to honor the request carved in fading ink, then set the journal beside him, hands resting on his knees, the firelight warming the stern planes of his face. He did not pray, yet a quiet vow formed in him all the same. Thane Alder's family would not vanish into the anonymous drift of time. The snow might erase tracks, but not all stories had to be lost. The fire had burned down to a deep red core when the second storm arrived, not with the slow gathering whisper of the first, but with a sudden, forceful impact that struck the sled cabin like a body thrown against a door. Alric Boone was awake before the sound fully registered, his tall frame already leaning forward from the bench, gray hair shadowed by lantern light, silver-streaked beard outlining a jaw that tightened with instinct rather than fear. Because men who had worked rescue in mountain winters learned to hear danger the way others heard music. The walls shuddered once, a heavy, low tremor, then another, and loose frost sifted from the beams overhead. Coda sprang up from the floorboards at the same instant, 5-year-old muscles coiling beneath his black and tan coat, amber eyes bright and alert, not barking, not panicking, simply watching the door as if the storm were a living thing testing the structure's will. Wind howled across the curved outer walls, not a whistle, but a deep, rolling roar like distant surf, and the snow struck in dense waves that rattled the iron fittings and sent vibrations through the planks. Alric crossed the small space in 2 strides, boots solid on the boards, and dropped the heavy timber brace he had noticed earlier into the interior latch groove, forcing it tight against the door frame. His shoulders strained, breath pushing hard through his nose, but the beam locked into place with a dull, satisfying thud. This was not the same moment as before, not discovery, not warmth found, but defense, the old reflex to hold ground. And something about that difference stirred an echo in him, the memory of nights in canvas shelters where he had braced tent poles against desert wind while distant gunfire pulsed, and of later nights in hospital corridors where he could brace nothing at all. He stepped back, scanning the seams along the walls, the roofline braces, checking for weaknesses the way he once checked ropes and anchor points. And all the while, Coda tracked his movement, staying close to his left side, not crowding, a quiet sentinel whose loyalty had outlived commands and uniforms. Another gust hit, harder, and the cabin groaned, the sound deep and wooden. But it held, the engineering of another century answering the violence of this one. Alric's gaze flicked to the floorboard he had pried open earlier, the hidden cavity beneath now closed again, and the weight of Thane Alder's final words pressed into him as heavily as the storm outside. He saw the rings, the small child's necklace, the map never followed, and a question formed that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with meaning. What does a man carry forward when he has already lost what he loved most? He sank back onto the bench,
hands resting on his knees, shoulders broad but bowed slightly,
the stern lines of his face softened by firelight. Coda stepped in close, warm flank against Elric's boot, then lifted his head and placed it gently on Elric's thigh. A simple gesture that cut through the noise more effectively than any shouted reassurance. Elric let his palm rest on the dog's neck, fingers pressing into thick fur, grounding himself in the steady pulse beneath. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin, something quieter unfolded. The realization that keeping the artifacts hidden would be another form of burial, another silence layered over the one he already carried. He had spent months trying to shrink his own pain by containing it, by speaking less, moving less, living smaller. But the journal he had read told a different lesson, one etched in wood and ink. Someone had prepared this shelter not only to survive, but to be found. The hidden message was no longer just instruction about vents or wind direction. It was a blueprint for memory, a design that assumed the future still existed. The idea felt strange and almost dangerous, like light after long darkness. Yet it settled into him with the certainty of duty. Another violent gust hammered the roof, snow sliding in a heavy sheet along the outer curve, and for a moment the cabin tilted in his senses, though it did not actually move. Ulrich rose again, checked the stove draft, adjusted a lower vent as the carvings advised, keeping smoke clear and heat steady. Each small action an answer to chaos. Coda paced once, twice, then stood facing the door, ears pricked, tail level, a soldier's stance. And Ulrich saw in the dog a mirror of himself. Two creatures from different eras, bound not by orders now, but by chosen loyalty. The storm went on for hours, time measured only by the fire's need for tending and the rhythm of wind against wood. And through it all, Ulrich's thoughts circled back to a single conclusion that grew clearer with each gust. The rings were not his to keep, the map not his to follow, the story not his to silence. When at last the wind's voice thinned and the blows against the walls softened into scattered whispers, exhaustion settled over him like an extra blanket. Yet beneath it lay a new steadiness, not the numb endurance he had worn for months, but a purpose that reached beyond himself. He slept in brief, shallow stretches, back against the wall, Coda curled at his feet, until pale morning light seeped through the thin gaps along the door edges. When he unbraced the beam and pushed the door open, cold air flowed in, sharp and clean, and the world outside had been remade. The storm had passed, leaving silence so complete it rang in his ears. Snow lay deep, but no longer falling. The sky a hard, polished blue, and the forest around the cabin looked as if giants had walked through it. Trees snapped, others uprooted, slopes carved by fresh drifts. The familiar terrain transformed into a maze of white mounds and dark, jagged shapes. Ulrich stepped out carefully, Coda at his side, and tested the ground with each boot, finding the snow crusted on top but unstable beneath. Every direction he looked, roots were blocked by fallen trunks or steep wind-sculpted walls. Leaving immediately would mean risk he did not need to take, not with the daylight just beginning. As he stood there, measuring options, Coda suddenly stiffened, head lifting, ears forward, nose angling downslope. The dog gave one short bark, not alarm, but signal. Alric followed the line of his gaze and saw movement between the broken trees. A figure in forest green outerwear pushing through waist-high drifts with the determined efficiency of someone who knew the land. She emerged slowly into clearer view. A woman in her early 30s, tall and rangy, shoulders strong beneath a ranger's jacket. Dark blonde hair braided tight and tucked under a wool cap, skin wind-reddened, eyes a clear steel gray that held both caution and relief. This was Seren Hale, though Ulrich did not yet know her name. Her face bore the calm focus of someone accustomed to searching in bad conditions, a steadiness shaped, as she would later say, by losing her older brother in a backcountry fall years before, an event that had driven her into this work and carved into her the refusal to leave anyone unlooked for. She raised one gloved hand, palm out, voice carrying clean through the cold air. "You made it through the night." There was no surprise in her tone, only acknowledgement, as if survival were expected, not miraculous. Alric nodded once, throat tight, then glanced back at the cabin, at the silent structure that had held against 2 storms across 2 centuries. No one was missing this morning, no life taken. Yet something had been recovered that might otherwise have vanished. As Seren approached, Coda relaxed slightly, tail lowering but still alert, reading her scent, her posture, deciding she was no threat. Alric felt the weight of the hidden artifacts in the cabin behind him, and for the first time since he had stepped into the mountains, the direction ahead did not feel empty. Weeks later, under the high, wind-polished sky of Cheyenne, the sled cabin stood again, not in the wilderness, but beneath the warm, deliberate lights of the Wyoming Historical Museum. Its curved pine walls preserved, iron runners stabilized, and the old stove cleaned, but left respectfully unaltered, as if time itself had been asked to pause rather than erase. Ulrich Boone entered the exhibit hall with the same broad, steady gait he had carried through the mountains, though now his boots rang softly on polished flooring instead of crunching snow, and the heavy winter coat he wore could not quite hide the way his shoulders still bore the memory of weight. At 55, he looked as he had in the cabin, tall, solidly built, iron-gray hair cut short, silver-threaded beard defining a stern, angular face marked by old scars and newer lines of grief. Yet the hardness strangers often read in him had softened into a quieter watchfulness. Coda walked at his side on a loose lead, back saddle of fur gleaming under indoor light, tan legs moving with the same economical precision, amber eyes alert but calm, tail low, his presence drawing curious glances from visitors who read his posture and understood he was not a pet alone, but a partner. The exhibit space held a respectful hush, the kind reserved for things that have survived more than they should have. And people moved slowly around the cabin, reading placards, leaning close to see the carved ventilation symbols still visible above the stovepipe. Ulrich paused at the threshold of the display, breath steady, hands slipping into his coat pockets, not from cold, but from habit, and let his gaze travel across the structure that had once been half buried in snow. He could still hear, in memory, the deep thud of wind against those boards, still feel the heat of the stove seeping into frozen fingers, and the contrast between that night and this bright hall struck him with quiet force. A boy stood near the glass case where Thane Alder's journal lay open to a carefully preserved page. The child, perhaps 7, narrow-faced, dark-haired, freckles scattered across pale cheeks. His small hands pressed against the edge of the display as he traced the inked letters with his eyes. Beside him was his mother, a woman in her late 20s with warm brown skin, thick black hair pulled into a low braid, and a soft, attentive expression that suggested patience worn into her by long days. Her posture protective but encouraging. "He built it so someone else could live," the boy murmured, not loudly, but clearly enough that Alric heard, and the words settled in him like an echo from another century. The placard beside the journal named Thane, Lillian, and Caleb Alder. The dates approximate, the story brief but careful. And beneath that, in smaller print, 2 lines read, "Recovered and documented by Alric Boone. Discovery assisted by working dog Coda." Alric felt the oddness of seeing his own name in that context. Not as a rescuer in an incident report, not as a husband on a hospital form, but as a bridge between times. He shifted slightly, uncomfortable with attention, yet unable to step away, because this place did not feel like a monument to him, but to the idea that endurance could outlast despair. A museum historian approached then, a slender man in his early 60s with neatly combed white hair, rimless glasses, and the careful, measured movements of someone used to handling fragile things, both objects and feelings. His name badge read Dr. Lionel Mercer, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the quiet enthusiasm of a man who believed history was not dead, but waiting to be heard. "Mr. Boone," he said gently, "we kept the carvings exactly as they were. The ventilation marks are some of the earliest examples we've seen of frontier airflow design documented in situ." Alric nodded, unsure how to answer praise that belonged more to a man long gone than to himself. "He thought ahead," he said finally, and heard the weight in his own words. Mercer smiled faintly. "That's what survives," he replied, then stepped aside, leaving Alric again with the cabin and the crowd. Coda shifted closer, pressing his shoulder lightly against Alric's knee, the same grounding gesture he had offered in the storm, and Alric rested his gloved hand on the dog's head, fingers threading into thick fur. The hall's warm air carried faint scents of polished wood and old paper, but beneath them, Alric imagined he could still detect smoke, pine, winter, the memory of the place before glass and lighting. His mind drifted not backward into loss, but sideways, into the strange alignment of events that had led him there. He had gone into the mountains, seeking nothing more than quiet space to endure his grief, not expecting direction, not hoping for purpose. And yet he had been guided, first by a dog's insistence, then by carved symbols, then by ink on brittle paper, each step a hand extended from another time. He realized with a kind of calm astonishment that his survival that night had not been separate from Thane Alder's preparation, but connected to it, that the shelter had been both refuge and message, the hidden truth, the one that could not be captured on a placard, was that stories, when carried forward, could do more than inform. They could rescue. A group of school children filed past, their teacher, a tall woman with graying red hair and a firm, kind voice, explaining how people once moved freight by sled across winter terrain, how design and foresight meant life or death. Alric watched the children's faces, open, curious, unshadowed by the losses that had carved his own, and felt not the sharp stab of memory, but a gentler ache, the kind that comes when pain is acknowledged rather than denied. Coda's ears flicked at a distant sound, An elevator chime, a door closing. But he remained composed. Trained discipline merged now with the ease of trust. Alric stepped closer to the glass case, holding the small child's necklace, the carved bone beads threaded on leather, and saw his own reflection faintly overlaying the artifact, the present and past meeting in the surface. He thought of Linnea, of the last winter he had helped her hang lights along the porch, her laughter bright against the cold, and instead of turning away from the memory, he let it stay, allowed it to share space with Caleb Alder's carved beads and Thane's careful script. Grief did not vanish, he understood now, but it could be given direction, like air through the correct vent, drawing smoke upward instead of choking the room. He did not know what the next years would hold, whether he would return often to these mountains or find other paths. But he knew he would not carry the silence in the same way. Mercer reappeared briefly, handing Alric a small program from the exhibit opening, and on its back was a quote from Thane's final page. "Do not let us be lost as snow beneath sun." Alric read it once more, then folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket, a different kind of keepsake. As visitors continued to move around the cabin, voices low, footsteps soft, Alric stood among them, not as a man rescued from wilderness, but as someone who had been called back into the human circle by a story that refused to disappear. Coda leaned into his leg, content, tail giving one slow, measured wag, and for the first time in a long while, Alric did not feel like a man walking through the aftermath of something broken, but like someone standing beside a fire that had been burning long before him and would continue after, a flame passed from hand to hand across winters, never truly going out. Sometimes the shelter that saves a life is not made of wood, but of memory. A man walked into the mountains carrying grief he could not put down, believing he had come only to endure silence. Yet what he found was a story left behind by hands that refused to surrender to winter. That story did not change the past. It changed the weight of the present. In everyday life, storms do not always look like snow. Sometimes they are hospital rooms, empty chairs at the table, bills we fear to open, or quiet nights that feel too loud inside our own thoughts. We try to carry everything alone, believing strength means silence. But this story reminds us of something gentle and powerful. When we carry forward the unfinished hope of others, our own hearts begin to warm again. Helping someone, remembering someone, telling someone's story, these are ways we keep the fire alive, not only for them, but for ourselves. If this story touched something in you, share it with someone who might need warmth today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Your voice matters here. Subscribe to the channel so more stories of courage, loyalty, and quiet miracles can find their way to people who need them. May God watch over you and your loved ones. May He give comfort in your storms, light on dark paths, and peace that stays even after winter has passed.